if you had to attack a really well defended position, defended by very grumpy soldiers with very good kit, would you rather have 100 guardsmen behind you or 1,000 Spaniards? Now, I know what I would choose. If I was opening a restaurant, I'd probably come to a different conclusion. But I think there was a feeling amongst the Irish that they were the aggressors, the get up and go. And I think that their soldiers were absolutely no different to the Coldstreamers or the Grenadiers, but I think they did have this belief in themselves that they were the great martial people, and that I think did have an effect.
There is constant fighting, and it's these small groups of German combined arms which is giving them a slight advantage over the British, which is, to my mind, they're trying to do a more traditional frontal assault on the Germans, and the Germans are responding with penny packets of combined troops which give them extra punch. It's not winning for the Germans, but it's not winning for the Americans and the Brits.
Hello. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 20th of September 1944 in Nijmegen, Holland, men of the 504th Regiment, US 82nd Airborne, embarked in canvas rowing boats and began an amphibious assault that was one of the most heroic in military history. Faced with the well-defended objective of the north end of the Nijmegen Bridge over the River Waal, 134 men were killed or wounded in the crossing, more than half the force. But the attack was a success and the bridge was captured. The road to Arnhem was the final piece in the jigsaw. Or was it? Joining me are two historians to discuss the operation as a whole, from the airborne forces tasked with capturing Eindhoven, Nijmegen and Arnhem, to 30 Corps and the German troops facing them. Gordon Corrigan takes the Allies and Philip Blood the German. Links are in the show notes, including those books mentioned at the start. Coming up on the Film Club, It's a Bridge Too Far. Please do give a generous rating if you can. And if you can subscribe or follow, please do. But until then, I'll hand you over to me, Gordon and Philip on Operation Market Garden. Hello, Philip and Gordon. Welcome back to the pod. Thank you very much for joining me for yet another in-depth look into a military operation from 1944. Gordon, hello.
Good afternoon.
And Philip, hello.
Hello, guys.
Now, this is Operation Market Garden. It's the 80th anniversary. This is the largest airborne operation of the war. I think you can correct me. Is this the largest ever airborne operation?
Yes, it's bigger than Crete.
Right.
Yeah, this is the biggest ever. And there'll never be one of that size again.
Isn't Varsity bigger?
Varsity a year later, in 1945, crossing the Rhine.
Crossing the Rhine.
Don't think there was many airborne troops crossing the Rhine, were there? I don't know. We need to check that one.
Right. Well, we'll have a steward's inquiry on that one. Just a note on that steward's inquiry. Operation Market Garden was the largest airborne operation during the war up to this point. Operation Varsity involved more aircraft, gliders and troops on the actual day of the operation, but Market Garden involved more troops flown in on subsequent days. So therefore, as a whole, Market Garden was the larger operation, but on the D-Day, i.e. day one of the operation, Varsity was larger. So happily, both our historians are right here. Back to the pod. Now, I've got my definitive account of Operation Market Garden, and you're both probably going to put your heads in your hands. This is A Bridge Too Far by Cornelius Ryan, written in the 60s.
Shall I go now?
What's our view of Cornelius Ryan, Philip? What was that? Oh dear, thumbs down. And Gordon?
I would rather It Never Snows in September, I think, is a better account.
Okay, right. Well, that's good to know. I'll then pretend not to have this. It Never Snows in September, right. Airborne Carpet, right. Well, I've also read Anthony Beevor's Arnhem, and then Saul David's written one on the Sky Warriors, and Arnhem 1944, you're saying, is very good, right? Martin Middlebrook. Okay, so I'll put the links to all these books in the show notes. Gordon, you'll have written about it. Oh, right. And The Army That Got Away. Okay. book upon book. Any we're missing out there, Gordon?
No, I mean Beaver's good, and so of course looks at all the airborne operations. So again, in the end, he's good. My personal preference is Never Sows in September, but I think Cornelius Ryan, when he was writing it, was jolly good. But of course, since then, an awful lot more information has come to light. A lot more files are available. So I think I would say he's now out of date.
Oh dear, that's a shame. So I read that in the early 90s and I loved it. I thought it was absolutely brilliant.
Well,
But then I'm just a
you're going to
punter.
enjoy it. You're going to enjoy it. I mean, we read lots of stuff that we know is out of date, but it's still enjoyable reading.
Yes, well, okay. So I'm slightly concerned then that I will make several mistakes, but you're both the experts to pick us up. So for listeners' benefit, we're going to follow the same model as before. So Philip is our honorary German. He is in Germany, so therefore can play that role well. And then Gordon is an allied historian for our sake today. And this is, of course, an allied operation with cooperation between the Americans, the British, and the Poles against the Germans. And so I guess I wanted to start with September 1944. And I personally am going to suggest to you both that we should never have done this. It was always going to fail because the plan, which I think was originally Operation Comet and then becomes Operation Market Garden, the plan needed so many things to go right that it couldn't possibly succeed. So do you mind, Philip, if I start with Gordon, because it's the British plan, and then you can sort of pick holes from a German perspective. But Gordon, what do you say to my suggestion there?
I would say that it was totally misconceived from the start. Even if we had succeeded in taking Arnhem, even if 30 Corps had got through, the thing could never. Do we seriously think that a German army commanded by Model would not have cut the corridor very, very quickly? There's only one road. It's only, 18 miles across. It's total nonsense. It was one of Montgomery's, unusually for Montgomery, because he was normally a very, very cautious commander. And I think he grabbed on this when Eisenhower wouldn't let him have all the resources for a thrust to Berlin. I'm rather inclined to agree with Montgomery that a thrust to Berlin might have been better, because, of course, the British agenda was to stop the Russians getting too far into Europe. And I suppose he thought of Market Garden as a sort of something he could perhaps do and get some support for. But I don't think it would ever have worked. Montgomery afterwards said that it would have worked if he'd had the support he'd needed. And of course, he wouldn't blame Horrocks, who was his poodle. He blamed O'Connor, whose corps was over to the east. And it certainly was nothing to do with O'Connor. I just don't think the thing could ever have worked. And I think it was misconceived from the start.
So, Philip, I'd be interested to know if you were General Model or von Rundstedt, his superior, and you had looked at the plan beforehand, you'd have thought, well, this will be easy for us to disrupt. You can disagree. It's fine.
Okay, so I totally disagree with Gordon on absolutely every point. I go back to 1969 when I saw a programme on the 25th anniversary of Arnhem, and the star cast was quite interesting because you've got Urquhart, Frost, Hackett, Adair, Mackenzie, and Jimmy Edwards. I don't know if people remember, but he was a RAF transport pilot and was shot down. He was a comedian later in life, but he was shot down during the operations and very badly burned. And all of these guys told the story from their perspective. But there was one person in there that has often been overlooked, and that's Willy Dietrich, who was the German SS commander of 2nd SS Panzer Corps. And of course, Dietrich in those days was the boss of the SS Veterans Organization. So his whole game was beef up how great the Red Devils were. What I listened to with the Red Devils was people who were saying it was an audacious raid. There were no regrets, and given a chance, and this is including Hackett, they would do it all over again. And at that age, I was surrounded by uncles who had fought in the Second World War and relatives and what have you. And they were all up for it. I mean, you know, if they could have gone back, they'd have all wanted to be part of the operation, whether on the ground or on the top. So from my perspective, as I developed and started to look towards a different direction with the Germans, and we've mentioned Robert Kirchhoff's book, It Never Snows in September, I started to look at a lot of the German side. Now, having recently discussed Warsaw and having spent the last 2 years investigating Modal's operations, supposed operations around the Warsaw Pocket in 1944, my overall impression of Modal is he's a pretty moderate, if not pretty average German officer. He's claimed to have broken this Soviet operation in Bagration outside Warsaw on the 1st of August, and then he's sent off to the west to lead Army Group B, and he sets up in Oosterbeek, which of course is unfortunately one of the landing zones. And if you look at the two comparisons of operations, Warsaw and Arnhem, they're pretty much the same. The Germans operate, I'm talking about outside the city, not inside the city. The Germans operate the same, which is to very quickly shut down the Soviet vanguard, or in this case, Airborne, and then constrict the advance of the supporting forces, which of course we know is 30 Corps, but not really go for a big victory. And you have to ask yourself, here's this moment, if Montgomery is so stretched out and it's such a problem, why didn't they go into a classical German canine movement, which is to encircle the whole of that operation and cut off the British forces? Fact is, they can't do it. And Modal is set to blunting spearheads and concentrating attacks from the Allies into pockets. He's not really there for the big, you know, from what the old battles like Kursk and before, massive operations. He shut down the spearhead into Germany and stop it. And of course, what you have is Montgomery going for the Ruhr. That's a huge threat to the Germans. So they have to stop that from happening. And of course, while they're doing that, stopping that from happening, they're also leaving opportunities, which sadly, other Allied operations like Bradley's First Army in Aachen are grinding into slowness, to be polite. So I don't think Modal is the great commander. I don't think he's blunted Montgomery other than just on that operation. He's not taken the great attack. And consequently, even though it's, you know, I forgot what the British Chief of Staff said, partial victories are not really victories. It's not, but it's an audacious move. And if I was Montgomery, given the situation we had at that time in 44, I think it's a good move. Although, saying that, I think the plan for Lynette, which is the 2nd of September 44, which was cancelled, obviously, might have had more impact if then 30 Corps had gone up a more direct route with the Americans also going through the Aachen corridor. That would have been such a punch. It would have split the Germans and opened the way up to the Rhine. But, you know, if doesn't happen in war, we have to
No,
go.
but your if there does suggest you're not overly enamored by the Allied plan. So, Gordon, is that fair to say?
Well, we can agree to disagree. The fact is that the operation failed for all sorts of reasons. Now, it might be worth asking, could it have succeeded? Brereton, of course, insisted that they could only do one airlift a day, and that was to do with the hours of daylight. I'm not convinced. I think, and a number of historians think that they could have done 2 lifts a day. Brereton himself wasn't very experienced. He wasn't a very experienced officer as the commander of the 1st Airborne Army. Browning came in for a lot of criticism from people like Gavin. Perhaps they would criticize him on the grounds that he really wasn't a very experienced officer as far as airborne operations were concerned. All that is true. Some of the criticisms that the British were too slow, I think they were aware of what the Germans could do. And certainly if you look at the whole of the Northwest Europe campaign, not just Market Garden, The units that are sticky tend to be the experienced units because they've come up against the Germans before, whether it's in North Africa or Italy or wherever. I just don't see that, even if the initial operation had succeeded and they had got the bridge to Arnhem, I just don't see how they could have kept that corridor open. Now we can argue as to whether Model was a good commander or whether he wasn't. I think he was, actually, and Manstein thought he was pretty competent. But I cannot see how the British or the Allies could have kept that corridor open. Montgomery said afterwards that he didn't have sufficient support. What support would he have wanted? I think the logistic effort of maintaining that corridor would have been enormous along only, well, there were two sort of parallel tracks to begin with, but essentially it's only one road. And even when you wander over the ground today, well, it's a much better road, and of course there's no flooding on either side, but you still think to yourself, well, really, could this possibly work? I just don't think it could.
Okay, so one thing I wanted to clear up for us is that this operation is hugely iconic, in part because of the Cornelius Ryan book, and then, of course, the film in 1977, which stars just about every Hollywood and British actor you can think of, and big names. And it's titled A Bridge Too Far because apparently in the planning meeting between General Browning, the commander of the Airborne, says to Montgomery at a meeting, I think on the 10th of September, supposedly, that I think we might be going a bridge too far, i.e. Arnhem Bridge is that bridge too far. And there's been subsequent historical debate on whether this meeting actually happened. I know in Saul David's book, he questions this meeting, as does Anthony Beaver. So I just wondered, does it matter that the meeting didn't actually maybe happen on the 10th of September? Perhaps it happened on the 9th, or I don't know, whenever they did meet in person. And the famous line was said, or do we actually question whether a bridge too far is a saying that never even, it's a subsequent invention?
I suspect, and I don't know, but I suspect it's the sort of thing that would be said afterwards. But I don't know. I don't know whether there's a written record of that particular conference in Kew. There may be. If there is, I haven't seen it. Philip may know a bit more about it than I do.
I really don't like Cornelius Ryan's book, and I didn't like the film. To me, the film is a bit like Saving Private Ryan with the British. It's just everything's wrong. You know, it's a book too far. We've got the British having tea and the Americans saying Hail Marys as they cross the river. It just doesn't work for me. And whether that comment took place or not, I'm not greatly convinced. Recently, I've been doing some research for a historian called Roger Cirillo, who's pretty much into this American side. So I've been looking through all the airborne papers which have survived, which I've literally been reading and then passing to Roger for his work. And I didn't find that comment. Of course, documents also give you a different picture. And my overall impression of the British Army's operations and planning for this exercise was incredibly impressive. You know, I know Urquhart wrote this report after the battle, which of course Cornelius Ryan wouldn't have had, because I don't think it was released until the mid-90s because of the Official Secrets Act and what have you. And I also remember Johnny Frost's obituary in the Times. There was no real mention of it being a bridge too far. I also kind of got the impression that all of the people who were involved didn't seem to blame Montgomery for any of it. It was always, we were unfortunate, we landed on a whole load of German equipment, the road just happened to be bad. And I think there was a more, how would you put it? Those people who were involved didn't see it the way we see it now.
Historians today can look at the evidence and dispassionately, they're not involved, didn't see their buddies die. So you can take a more, I suppose, unemotional look at what happened. Do you think that's partly partly it?
I think we should. simply because I think there's too much emotion in history in cases anyway. We take the emotion out and put the documents in and judge the evidence correctly. I particularly like Robert Kershaw's book because he describes it as a former, or was at the time, a soldier, explaining, and for the civilian, explaining how airborne operations were countered by the Germans. That was fascinating. But the side of it, well, the other side of Robert's book is he keeps referring to NATO this, and it's kind of aged the book with an element of unwitting nostalgia. I don't mean it in the nasty way. It's just that he was involved in NATO and he was making these references. What we need to do is to find a new German interpretation of how the Germans fought in that battle. And also at the same time, I think it's right that British historians continue to engage with the British side. Because if I go back to the Anglia TV programme, I remember Urquhart and Hackett mentioning that there was a moment in Oosterbeek when the British commanders, without Urquhart being around, started to argue over what they should do with the troops because there was no senior command. And that kind of situation in the middle of the battle reminds me of how Model was. Apparently, again, more gossip, believing that the troops had landed on him to capture him, which, really? You're going to jam that many troops on just to get one German general? So it was all kind of, the film, the book, doesn't work for me at all.
I think there's two things we've got to remember. First of all, an awful lot of people at the time thought that Germany would crumble. We'd liberated Paris, we'd got up to Holland, the port of Antwerp had been captured, but of course the estuaries and whatnot hadn't been cleared. It was one of the problems. But people did believe the Germans would crumble easily, and therefore they must have thought that this would be rather easier than it might have been, a year or two earlier. Also, the fact that of course the paratroopers and the soldiers were up for it. I mean, the poor buggers, they've been stood to and stood down. I mean, something like 12 times for operations that didn't happen. So when at last there's an opportunity of doing something, they actually, of course, they're very much up for it. And indeed, the High Command, they'd created this airborne army. Well, let's do something with it. And I think those attitudes very much affected the way they operated and what they did.
Okay, well, Philip, you alluded to the presence of German panzers in the Arnhem vicinity. And one of the big controversies of the operation is that a intelligence officer of the Airborne Division, I think he's a major, it could be Major Urquhart, annoyingly the same name as the divisional commander. And he flagged this as a problem prior to the drops. And do we over-exaggerate his intelligence reports, or was he right and therefore proven right? I mean, history suggests he was proven right because they did cause so much trouble in Arnhem, Philip.
Roger Cirillo thinks it's all nonsense. I tend to think it's all nonsense. The first thing is, if we believe, I'm going to be cautious now. If we believe that all of that ultra stuff was actually advising the British command that they knew, well, all the Allied command, that they knew where all the Germans were, then they knew they were landing into an area with two German armies, which was the 1st Parachute Army and the 15th Army. You're on top of Army Group B headquarters, which in itself is a huge organization, and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. But on top of that, you've also got the Hermann Goering Panzer Division's training ground and collection areas, plus all the supporting units in that area. Plus you're on the primary railway links to the German reserves in Wehrkreis 6, which is the area for Munster, which is directly opposite Arnhem. So they can shift supply and equipment far faster. And with the Royal Air Force not taking out the bridges or the railway lines, the Germans are bringing reserves into the area. So with all of that activity, with presumably Ultra giving them the evidence, they would have known that was they were going into an area of a large buildup of German forces. On top of that, the Dutch resistance was supplying information. I know there's problems with the Dutch resistance from the famous circle and what have you before, but there was information coming from Holland going to the British troops that this was happening. In addition, the troops, as they were moving forward towards the Scheldt, they knew that the Germans were in a tough position. And if you look at, I mean, I've just recently looked at the Queen's Regiment's reports for moving into this area, and they're all taking in reports about German armour, German anti-tank guns, German field artillery, and also producing maps about swamp areas and the correct roads. So the amount of information that's coming into the British Armed Forces was quite remarkable. At the same time, the Germans have been in Holland now for 4 years, and they know how well the terrain is and how they can sort things out. And one of the things that's often forgotten in this story is, while these operations are taking place, 15th Army is quietly escaping from the trap that was being set for it, and then coming back into the battle. There's a major question there. Is that American responsibility with the First Army? Yeah.
Okay. But, okay, so with the presence of so much German armour, and if they already knew about it, you're sending in lightly armed paratroopers, and about the biggest, heaviest weapon the British have is the Piat, Gordon, which to me seems a bit of a pea shooter. I know I'm probably committing heresy here, but how could they possibly put up a proper fight against Tiger tanks and other such armour?
One of the problems of airborne troops is, of course, that they are limited in the number of heavy weapons they can have. Now, in fact, the gliders did bring in a certain amount of light tanks, the Tetrox. So they did have some heavy weapons, but when you're using paratroopers or airborne troops, you put them in, and then you are usually to do a coup de main or a a bit bigger than a coup de main, but this is what it was really. It was to take the Arnhem Bridge, but you've got to relieve them very quickly, because they're limited in how much they can bring in. They're limited in the number of the amount of ammunition they've got, the amount of heavy weapons they've got, the amount of rations they've got, and that sort of thing. And really, you really don't want to leave them in there for more than a couple of days normally before you relieve them. And of course, you start off with dropping them quite a long way from Arnhem, and this was because the air forces said, "Oh no, there's too much anti-aircraft, too much flak," which is why they dropped them where they did drop them. That meant they had quite a long way to get to Arnhem. And when they got there, when are they going to be relieved? And all that really made the whole thing perhaps more difficult than it need have been.
Okay, so just for the benefit of listeners, I'll give a very brief layman's description of what the plan was. So you have the American 101st going to drop on Eindhoven and its environ, I think including Grave, have I got that right? And then the 82nd get Nijmegen, which is the next city north. And then finally the British Airborne Division gets Arnhem, the prize, apparently. And then they provide the carpet, and then the British 30 Corps under the command of General Horrocks, and this is tanks and things like that, they then punch a hole through the German lines and link up with each airborne group until they've captured Arnhem, and then the boys will be home by Christmas, basically. That's the plan. The war knocked Germany for 6, and the war is over. So if we begin with the 101st and Eindhoven, that actually is that airborne drop that goes a little bit better than the others. Is that the most successful of the lot, Eindhoven?
Well, there's 2 bridges. They've got to take the bridges at Somme. There are 2 bridges at Somme, in fact, and then the bridge at Waal, and that was fine. I mean, they got those. So it was the taking of the bridges running up to Arnhem wasn't so much of a problem. They had a bit of a problem with Nijmegen getting over the bridge there, but they did it. Really, I suppose it might have been much more sensible to give Arnhem to the Americans. The reason, of course, they didn't was as much political as anything else, in that it was a British operation, and Arnhem was going to be the most difficult, the most dangerous bit of that of market, and therefore it really would have had to have been given to the British. So that was was the thinking. I
I
mean,
see.
otherwise you've got the Americans saying, now remember, relations at the lower level were actually pretty good between the Americans and the Poles and the British, but at the higher level they were extremely bad. Montgomery and Bradley and Devers and Eisenhower on the top, they did not get on, and there were all sorts of problems. But if you'd given the most difficult, the most dangerous bit of the operation, which was Arnhem, to the Americans, you might well have the American press saying, "Oh, the British once again are sending American boys to die," for them, and that's why it was decided very early on that Arnhem would be British, not American.
And Gordon, we shouldn't forget, of course, the Poles under General Sosabowski, and he is reluctant. He's not overly enamored by this plan either, and this is before the operation. And this causes quite a stink afterwards, and he's treated very badly. Am I fair in saying that?
Yeah, he certainly did have doubts. They performed very well when it actually came to it. Afterwards, yes, there was much criticism of the British by the Poles. Of course, allied to that is the whole problem of the Lublin government, the Polish, and then the Polish government in exile. The Russians will have nothing to do with them. They established the Lublin government, the communist government. A lot of the Poles know that they probably, the war will be over fairly quickly. Can we go home? Probably we can't.
Well,
so
they wanted to go into
whole,
Warsaw, didn't they?
Yeah, there's a whole Polish problem. They know very well that the Russians are preventing the RAF from helping the Warsaw Rising and all that sort of thing. So there's a problem for the Poles, and yes, they certainly did criticize the British planning. I think they were doubtful about it before it happened, but they went along with it. They didn't have much choice but to go along with it, and they criticized it afterwards with some justification.
Okay. Philip, anything to add with the Polish angle? Because I know you've been working on Warsaw.
Well, obviously, the discussions about dropping the Poles into the Warsaw uprising was a constant theme, and
was that actually a realistic plan?
No.
Well, the Americans dropped troops. The Americans dropped supplies into Warsaw. People forget the Russians were actually dropping Russian troops into Warsaw to support the Polish First Army crossing the assault across the river. None of it was very successful. Was it one of those kind of actions that they expected where their honor would be satisfied and they would have all been killed? It's hard to say. Could they have moved the Polish brigade down to Italy to then transport them to Warsaw? Really, I don't think that's very practical. If they'd have tried to get across on a flight, they would have been taken to pieces by the Luftwaffe, which a lot of people think, has disappeared. It certainly hasn't, and it's still a pain when it needs to be, as Jimmy Edwards remembers when he was shot down by a Focke-Wulf 190. No, I don't think it was a serious thing. I just think in Polish memory, it's important that they be seen to try to do something for Warsaw. That's the big political issue, because the Soviets have decided that it's not going to happen.
I see.
Okay, well, political issue. I don't think it's really a realistic military operation.
Okay. Well, when 30 Corps do break through the German lines to basically kick off the op, or they use the Guards Armored Division, and I remember reading the Beaver book, Anthony Beaver's book on this, and he's critical of, I think, on two levels. I think I'm getting this right. Is that for a start, the Guards Armored Division are perhaps not the most, I guess, aggressive unit to use when you want to get somewhere fast. And then secondly, because of that, they don't take the deadlines too seriously. So I think on the first day, they sort of, they stop earlier than they needed to. And there seems to be a kind of approach that we need to have everything, all our ducks in order before we move on in the second day and that kind of thing. Whereas what they really should have done is just go like hell, as Horrocks had said in the briefing beforehand. Is that a fair criticism, Gordon?
Well, getting all your ducks in a row before you do anything is very much Montgomery. I mean, that was his policy all along. I think they're possibly unfairly criticized. What they were concerned about was, they were accused of stopping for tea. What they were actually concerned about was they didn't want to push on in dark. Now, tanks are useless then. They're not all that much good now in dark, but at least they've got image identification kit. They didn't then, and tanks at night then really were no good at all. And they needed infantry. If they were going to do anything at night, they'd want infantry to go in front, and they wouldn't be much good anyway. You could argue whether it was ever sensible of the British to take the best infantry in the British Army, i.e. the Guards, and turn them into armor. But that's a sort of separate issue. I think they were somewhat unfairly criticized, in fact.
Well, I am going to speak up for one of the Guards regiments, which I think is at the pinpoint of the spear in breaking through German lines, is that I remember Beaver being questioned on this, and apparently the Irish Guards had the reputation for being the most aggressive of the Guards regiments. And I don't know if that's damning the Guards with faint praise or is actually true. There is that tradition of the Irish regiments being great fighters going back to the Napoleonic era and before. Is that a bit of just inter-regimental squabbling?
I think it's going back to the martial races theory, isn't it? There may not be anything terribly scientific about it, but if you keep telling people long enough that they're an elite and they're martial, they will come to believe it. But I mean, as I sometimes say to people who question this, I say, look, if you had to attack a really well defended position, defended by very grumpy soldiers with very good kit, would you rather have 100 guardsmen behind you or 1,000 Spaniards? Now, I know what I would choose. If I was opening a restaurant, I'd probably come to a different conclusion. But I think there was a feeling amongst the Irish that they were the aggressors, the get up and go. And I think that their soldiers were absolutely no different to the Coldstreamers or the Grenadiers, but I think they did have this belief in themselves that they were the great martial people, and that I think did have an effect.
Well, we've got that bit out of the way. We've resolved that. That's a relief. I didn't want to have to have a go at the rest of the Guards because it seems terribly unfair. Right. So, Philip, sorry to have to indulge me for a moment on that, but the Americans, the 101st at Eindhoven and then the 82nd at Nijmegen, the German troops there are eventually overcome. And I wanted to just, you've described the state of play at Arnhem. What was it like at Eindhoven and then also Nijmegen? Because the Americans obviously have great trouble in Nijmegen, and we'll get to the river crossing, I think, after we've dealt with this, because that's one of the most extraordinary assaults of the whole war, I think. But what about the German forces in Eindhoven and Nijmegen?
I tend to follow Robert Kershaw, who talks about the stiff resistance that the German infantry regiments and battalions were putting up against that first 30 Corps moves. I'm kind of betwixt and between on this, because if I go back to the programme when Adair was talking, he was saying that the Guards Armoured pushed ahead in dusk and darkness because the Germans faded, and that the Germans really did not like night fighting. I've not really found Robert Kershaw or anybody else to confirm that kind of comment, and it certainly seems very interesting. Adair was very convinced that the Germans faded at night, and he could push towards the river lines. I'm kind of queasy about this, because I think while the tanks are going down the roads trying to get the infantry to flush out the anti-tank screens, but all the while the Germans are putting up anti-tank screens and these Kampfgruppen are setting huge defences, which is just making it more and more. It's not stopping the British at this stage. It's just making things hard. There's a moment when, the sixth, the Guards Armoured is trying to get to the sixth, and they suddenly face 3 tanks being wiped out in seconds because German anti-tank gunners have been so strong. And that kind of support that the Germans were getting down in the battle was actually working for them. And we kind of miss that they're layering mines everywhere and causing as much pressure on the move forward. The Germans, on the whole, have responded quite well. So they're trying to push the Americans into small pockets. I don't know if you remember the series Band of Brothers. They tried to show the Americans joining up with the ground forces, and there's a fair old ding-dong with a Tiger tank and a big fight there. I'm not greatly convinced that Stephen Ambrose is correct in these matters, but there is constant fighting, and it's these small groups of German combined arms which is giving them a slight advantage over the British, which is to my mind, I can only say from the way I've seen it, they're trying to do a more traditional frontal assault on the Germans, and the Germans are responding with penny packets of combined troops, which give them extra punch. And it's slow, as I say, it's slowing the British down, and the Americans, it's preventing them from taking advantage and using initiative to expand what they're doing. It's not winning for the Germans, but it's not winning for the Americans and the Brits.
Perhaps you can both help clear this up, actually, because the Germans have got this reputation for being very good at reacting to Allied attacks. And actually, I think the Americans get that reputation as well. That's not necessarily the case with the British, is it? Philip, go ahead.
The Germans are known for this attitude of reacting to a given situation. A lot of it is driven by the NCOs in the field, who are, I have to say, the greatest fighting power of the German army is in the NCOs. If the NCOs decide they're going to fight, every army has a problem, because it's not just that they're going to take some hits. The Germans are then going to counterattack, and they're very, very aggressive. It's part of the doctrine, or even to a certain extent, German army dogma, that once you get hit, you hit back harder, and you constantly do that. And of course, with seasoned NCOs, which we know are in the 2nd SS Panzer Corps at this stage, because they've been managing to trawl out all the training NCOs from all the detachments and rebuilding the 2 divisions. Down at the lower end, with all the troops that are coming from 15th Army, which many of whom have not seen action but are in reasonably good condition, are being pushed into the line, and that's forcing the Brits and the Americans to fight hard, stiff battles. So that's my view from the German side.
Gordon.
Yeah, I think Philip's absolutely right. The problem from the British point of view was that, or the difference was that the Germans were all trained to the same standard operating procedures. So in the German army, you could take a tank battalion, an infantry battalion, and an artillery regiment, put them together, they'd never met, put them together, give them an op, and off they'd go, because they'd all been trained, everybody had been trained how to deal with armor, how to work with armor, how to work with artillery, etc., etc. Now, the problem the British had, and to an extent still have to this day, is that units tended to have their own standard operating procedures. And therefore, if you put together a British infantry battalion and an armored regiment and an artillery battery, let's say, the first thing they had to do was decide how they were going to operate with each other, because they hadn't all been brought up to the same standard operating procedures. And therefore, the British were much slower to react generally than the Germans. And it's quite interesting reading some of the German diaries from North Africa, admittedly, but I think probably much the same applied in Europe, where a number of them said, well, whenever you bumped the British, what would happen would be you'd hear a great deal of shouting, and then a long period of silence, and then an attack would come in from the right or the left. Now, of course, at Market Garden, they couldn't deploy, the British 30 Corps couldn't deploy off the road as they normally would, particularly with armor, because the ground was either too soft or flooded or whatever. So all they could do was frontal attacks. It wasn't possible to go off flanking or to deploy either side of the road. And this was undoubtedly a problem. And what, of course, the Germans were able to do was slow them up. And that's what they had to do, actually. They just had to slow them up, hand them off, hand them off, hand them off, pull back, make them try and deploy, hand them off and back, because the more they can be slowed down, the less chance the overall operation has of succeeding. And by this time, they must have twigged what the British were after. I mean, it would have taken a bit of time to work out what the Schwerpunkt was. But once they'd worked that out, then all they got to do really is slow them down, which they were pretty successful in doing.
Okay, so I think by day 3, which is I think the 19th of September, the 30 Corps has managed to reach Nijmegen. Oh, it's day 4. Sorry,
That's what
day
I thought. But you know when you have the doubt in your head, you go,
yeah, sorry. The way I confess, I'm for convenience looking at Wikipedia, and day 3 and 4 are merged together. So
it was the 20th, wasn't it?
yes, exactly,
20th,
the 20th.
Which is day 4, yeah.
Yeah, so day 4. So now let's bear in mind that according to the plan, day 4, everyone should be having their feet up, drinking gin and tonics, celebrating a glorious operation, because it should have been over in 2 days. Day 4, we're at Nijmegen, and they can't take the bridge because they don't have the town. And the only way, or the best way to take a bridge, Robert Redford says, is by taking 2 ends at once. And I wanted to talk about this because I find this, having read by all accounts, I think it's fair to say, this is an extraordinary amphibious assault across the river Waal.
The Waal, yeah.
And it is the American 82nd on these sort of really flimsy boats attempting to storm the opposite side of the Waal and therefore take the north end of the Nijmegen Bridge. Meanwhile, the Guards Armored Division 30 Corps will be fighting through Nijmegen to take the other end of the bridge. You've got Nijmegen, and then all you have to do is get to Arnhem and the prize. So, Gordon, can we talk a little bit about the heroism displayed on that day? Because reading it again, I mean, it gets all your juices flowing when you read this stuff. I mean, even in Saul's most recent book, he does mention it because it's so extraordinary. It is an incredible attack, isn't it?
It is, particularly when it's done in daylight and done with the boats they were using were in fact canvas, collapsible, so-called assault boats. They weren't assault boats, really. And it was an amazing operation. And it's extraordinary that it succeeded at all. Yeah, full marks to them.
And Philip, you've really have broken my heart because you are not impressed by A Bridge Too Far. But having read all these accounts and then having watched the depiction in Richard Attenborough's film, that crossing of the river is done brilliantly, and it seems to be pretty realistic.
I don't know, I wasn't there.
Well, they're using canvas boats in daylight.
I could use the Nicholas Ridley thing for Napoleon. I wasn't there, so who knows?
No, that's unfair. You can't get away with that.
That's terribly mean. Just because it's made in Hollywood doesn't immediately mean it didn't happen.
Okay, I know it happened, and the troops are very brave, and you could see the smoke screens going up if we watch the film, and there's various stories about what happened and how it went off, and I accept that. All the ordinary soldiers worked desperately hard to sacrifice themselves to get the job done. It's incredible. But I would bring in a ringer now at this stage, and it's this. The man who's now probably directing German ideas is a guy called Kurt Student. And Student is a parachute general who understands the problems for parachute troops, and he knows the restrictions, which Model doesn't. Modal's not got that experience. So Kurt Student will be telling people like Harmel and Harzer and Bittritz and all of these guys, you've got to seal up the areas. So I think what they tried to do at Nijmegen, as they did in the earlier bridges, is to seal up areas. Now, there's a side to this which I find moderately difficult to understand because it's never really been discussed in a battle. That's the 2 corps on the flank who are supposed to be going up the other side, supposedly drawing off German troops from these areas. So that's another side. I don't want us to go down that too far down that at the moment, but it does seem to me that Kurt Student has come up with the right, correct process to hold things off. So the Allies have to make these kind of sacrifices, like the boat attack across the Waal, and it works, and it's a success. But am I convinced that they then stop for tea? No.
So this is the controversial bit, and this is where this is, I think, based. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to quote Cornelius Ryan quoting General Gavin, but General Gavin, he, I think, supports his colonel, I forget the name, who was very upset at the Grenadier Guards who didn't then push on through towards Arnhem. They did stop because they needed infantry support coming out of Nijmegen. And the Americans are very upset with the British about that. And I've got a quote from Gavin stating that in the Ryan book. I cannot tell you the anger and bitterness of my men. I found Tucker at dawn so irate that he was almost unable to speak. There is no soldier in the world that I admire more than the British, but British infantry leaders somehow did not understand the camaraderie of airborne troops. To our men there was only one objective, to save their brother paratroopers in Arnhem. It was tragic. So I'm sorry I've brought up the Ryan book, but presumably that's not a made-up quote by Ryan. We're not suggesting Ryan is inventing stuff. But the Americans really were upset with the British here, weren't they, at this stage of the operation, Gordon?
No, they were. But they didn't stop for tea. Well, they might have had tea as well. But what they were concerned about was putting armour forward without infantry support. This was the problem. And that's why they didn't want to go ahead just with armour. That was the debate. Now, you could say, well, they should have said, to hell with it, off we go.
Time was of the essence, Gordon.
Time was of the essence, but is there any point in going straight on if you know that your chances of not making it are considerable? Because they can't deploy off the roads or hardly off the roads. The Germans, even the Panzerfaust, the little fire and throw away bit of kit, that will knock out a Sherman without any problems. And I think the commander at the time, the battalion commander, had a terribly difficult decision to make. Time's of the essence, I've got to get to Arnhem. Do I push on and probably have all my tanks knocked out? Or do I wait for infantry support when I know I will be, or a reasonable good chance of getting through? And that's the decision he had to make. Now, we can say in hindsight, perhaps it was the wrong decision. I'm not convinced it was, but we could say in hindsight it was the wrong decision. But you have to look at that. It's like all these military problems. You have to look at it in the way that a judicial review will say, could a reasonable person or a reasonable organization, faced with the evidence they were faced with, come to the decision that they did come to, even if we, in the same situation, might have come to a different decision. Now, if the answer is yes, a reasonable man, the commander of the battalion, could have come to that decision, well, that's it. Whatever we can say later on.
But then is it, therefore, what was the point of really the amphibious assault if they weren't, all they were going to do is capture the bridge and then stay there the night? They may as well have
well, then they've got the bridge. You've got to get the bridge before you can do anything. Now they've got the bridge.
But if you're not going to advance from the bridge, why not wait till it's dark and then attack across the river?
Well, the longer you wait, the more time the Germans have got to blow the bridge, apart from anything else. And indeed, when they did cross the bridge, there was a fear that the Royal Engineers had managed to cut some of the demolition caused. Now, the argument was the demolitions were there, but whether they at stage 1 or stage 2, we don't know. But the longer you don't get the bridge, the more time you've got for the Germans, A, to bring up more troops, B, to blow the bridge, or whatever. So again, I don't think it was an unreasonable decision. In hindsight, possibly the wrong decision, but not an unreasonable decision.
Philip, anything to add on that?
Well, again, I'd go back to what General Adair, the Guards Armoured Division commander, claimed, that once they were across, they made a dash and the first 3 tanks were taken out. Now, I don't know how accurate that story is. or whether it was just said 25 years later as a passing comment in a general story about Arnhem, which, without documents and blah, blah, blah. If it's the case, as Adair says, the next problem was clearing the road of the 3 tanks. So you've made the decision to rush forward. You've smacked straight into an anti-tank gun screen, which the Germans have cleverly used as a roadblock, if you like. And then suddenly you've increased your problems by putting wrecks on the road. And then you've got to clear them to get through, especially given that the ground is so soft for Sherman tanks and so forth. Did they stop for tea? I don't think they did. I think they carried on fighting. I think they carried on pressing. I just don't think soldiers that close to the enemy suddenly just stop and throw the towel in. I think there's a lot more activity. Even in you're not moving forward, you're still doing things to protect yourself, to secure the situation, to reconnoiter, to seek out an indication of where the enemy is. And that's why I don't particularly like films like
I can see exactly what you mean here, actually.
Because you're missing the minutiae of the battle. Because the minutiae of the battle is not interesting to a film and the film follower. Because endless patrols of British soldiers and British infantry going out, which, if you only have to read the Queen's, there's 6 or 7 patrols every night of troops all along their own front. So I can't see that the operating procedure is going to stop simply just for having crossed the bridge. I would say they're even more interested in securing their position, knowing how they stood, and getting ready to move forward. It's partly consolidating the victory of taking the bridge and preparing to go forward, as Gordon says.
I was going to say, in addition to what Philip says, all of which is absolutely correct, there's a question, for example, of refueling. A Sherman tank refueling, you're looking at 40, I think it's something like 43 jerry cans, all of which have to be manhandled. They don't have a Bowser for every tank. So that has got to be done. They've all that sort of thing takes time, and you can't send tanks forward if they haven't been refueled.
I do completely see what you're both saying here, particularly Philip around the film, and I can tell it's that particular section is, well, for the benefit of listeners, and we'll be covering A Bridge Too Far on our film club. And it was Richard Attenborough, we can go off on a slight tangent here, please indulge me. Richard Attenborough was making an anti-war film. He said that himself in subsequent interviews. And the scene that we're talking about, or rather the events that we're talking about, which is then portrayed on film, does have a number of British Shermans stopped with no enemy nearby, and everyone's sort of wandering around, and it looks very quiet. It looks like a nice afternoon. It's a bit misty, but that's it. And so I completely see what you're saying, that it gives the impression that there really is no fighting and they haven't really suffered any losses whatsoever. So that does seem unfair. And plus you're going to just sit here and drink tea is the sort of final insult. But I suppose they wanted to get across the American upset at the British not pushing forward.
The problem with all of this is it panders to the stereotypes of what can only be said crap history. It's like watching The Longest Day. I can't watch that either because I don't like Cornelius Ryan's depiction of Normandy. Actually, I don't like any of his books, so, move on. But the problem is you're pandering to all these stereotypes. And what I see from British filmmaking, which I think is a huge error, is they've gone down the road from having seen what happened with The Longest Day. They make the Battle of Britain, and we go through all of those stereotypes between the British fighter pilots and the German fighter pilots and bombers and what have you. And then we have it with the Bridge Too Far. And I think the Brits miss a certain trick. I understand, it's an anti-war film, just like, George C. Marshall didn't want to take the Oscar for Patton because he was an anti-war person at the time the film Patton got the medal. But I think you have to take these films out of the equation and start looking at what actually happened on the ground. And I think it's a more complicated situation looking at what happens when they get across Nijmegen and they try and reach the guys at Arnhem. And it's very hard because they must be receiving, as far as I understand it, they had now information Oosterbeek was being collapsed by the Germans from all sides. You got the lads on Arnhem Bridge are about to have to throw in the towel because they're overwhelmed. You're trying to get to that to ease that situation. I can't believe British soldiers turn around and say, "Oh, you know, they can wait until I have my cup of tea." It's just unrealistic. Yeah, just not how British soldiers are.
Yeah.
Yeah, Philip's absolutely right. The trouble from our point of view, Philip's point of view, my point of view, your point of view, all historians' point of view, is that the public get their history from television. They watch films and they think that that's what actually happened. And when you start talking to them about primary sources, they don't know what you're talking about. And we're up against this all the time, unfortunately.
But okay, so my view on this is that you know, say you got 100 people watch A Bridge Too Far, 50 will never be interested ever again. They'll enjoy the film, think that they've just watched history. Another 50 will look into it a little bit more, and maybe 25 of that 50, maybe 25 of that 100, or maybe a bit less, will buy a book. And maybe that book will not be the Cornelius Ryan one. It'll be the most recent book on this, because there's books constantly coming out about it. So whilst I agree with you that the film's a terrible history and it has historians such as yourselves pulling your hair out, it does serve a purpose, because there will be a percentage of people who will want to find out more.
Well,
Because
we always hope that, but
I would add another thing here that has kind of put a new dimension on it, and that's the Band of Blubbers, where they talk about rescuing Airborne from Oosterbeek. I don't know if you remember that episode. You've had the hard fighting, you've had the Dutch resistance, you've had the people in the streets, you've had the problem getting equipment in, and there's all fighting all over the place. And the men of Easy Company are involved in bringing home some of the paratroopers, and there's they have that Currahee moment. And I think that creates another dimension to the story that also needs to be investigated, because on the one side you've got the British saying that they were the main rescuers of their own troops, and now we've got the Americans being the rescuers of the troops, and that adds another dimension of problem, not only for the historian but for the viewer.
it's like that terrible film U-5173 or something, where the Americans find the Enigma machine and not the Royal Navy. But anyway, right. So we've mentioned a few times, you've mentioned a few times the SS, and I think they're under the command of General Dietrich.
Billy Beach.
Yes, I'm not going to mention the film anymore. But I'm assuming because he was in the SS, he's been stationed in Arnhem to refit and rearm and relax, having committed terrible war crimes for wherever they were before. Is that right?
Well, his corps got absolutely hammered in Normandy, especially during the Falaise period, and those troops, they escaped and fled back to Holland for refitting and reoperation. The more complex story about Beatrix is not so much his command of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which he kind of uses as a platform to make himself look like a good person, so that when the Americans or the British capture him, they won't treat him for war crimes. But his actual history is rather quite unpleasant. For a while, he was commander of the SS Cavalry Division, conducting rear area operations in Soviet Russia, and of course was compiling a huge record of killing Jews. He was also involved in some unpleasant business in the Balkans. He had quite a track record of unpleasantness, unfortunately. Many of his officers were of a similar vein. The problem is, on the 9th of September, when the BBC announced over Warsaw that all of these men were going to be taken in as war criminals, and the commander of the SS forces in Warsaw was a named war criminal on the 9th of September 1944, word got round. So they all suddenly started to behave a little bit more correctly. I mean, some of them went off message, like Piper during the Ardennes and the Malmedy massacre. But generally speaking, the commanders went very, very clean and started to behave well. Beatrix, in looking after the British wounded, tells one story. A more harder story for the British to understand is why the initial British paratroopers who were captured were sent to a camp in Auschwitz. Now, that's a much harder story to tell. The reason why dates back to the 1942 Bandenbekämpfung order and doctrine for the handling of troops landing far behind front lines. Because they were over 30 kilometers, Airborne was technically, in the German mind, bandits. So the first SS troops to capture British paratroopers in Arnhem sent them to a camp in Auschwitz. It's where Monowitz, where they were working as slave labor for the synthetic tire rubber IG Farben works. The issue there is the story keeps coming up that Paras are in Auschwitz. They saw things, they experienced stuff. But that story has never really been brought into the mainstream histories of the campaign because it's kind of got lost or swept away or ignored as a one-off. I actually think it's very significant because at the same time in Italy, a German general has decided to execute a whole load of American Rangers for conducting a special operation which was 45 kilometers behind the main front line in the Italy area. So these things are happening, and it's easy to say, well, Beatrix went around giving, as he does in the film, bars of Cadbury's chocolate to Frost. But underneath, there's another story. And that then dates back to what happened on the 20th of July, which historians are now beginning to understand in a different way. On the 20th of July, Chief of Staff of the Army was Guderian. But his sidekick, if you like, in military operations, was Heinrich Himmler, who was given command of the Reserve Army and all the reserves. And Himmler's concept for national security in the face of all of these attacks coming towards the Third Reich was to radicalize the army with heavy Nazi dogma, race dogma, and pushing the troops for extreme action. So on the one hand, you've got Beatrix and some troops behaving what we would say within the Geneva Convention. Elsewhere, and British troops are beginning to experience it closer and closer they get to the German border. And the same with the Americans in Aachen and Herkenwald and other places. They start to experience a new kind of violence from the German soldiers, which is changing the battle. It's changing the nature of the war. And it's this bitterness at the end of the war that many of the veterans remember, and it starts to emerge as the Brits start to face stiff resistance in Arnhem.
No, I had no idea about the paratroopers being sent to Auschwitz. Right, so back to the operation. Now, I should just remind listeners that we'll be covering Arnhem in great detail with Saul David. I think we've just covered it, or we are about to cover it. I'm getting confused with which episode's coming out before, but either way, we've either heard it or are about to hear it. But Arnhem, British airborne forces have suffered terribly in Arnhem and west of Arnhem. But Gordon, they fought heroically, haven't they? They were only meant to be there for 2 days. This is up there with some of the greatest British examples of heroism, really.
Yeah, the division was about 12,000 strong, and 8,000 of them became casualties or became prisoners, killed, wounded, taken prisoner. Which is a huge butcher's bill. They did their best, as I've said right at the beginning, and I know Philip doesn't agree. I think the whole operation was misconceived from the start, and I think in many ways their lives were thrown away. But that doesn't detract from what the soldiers themselves. They fought valiantly. They did their best against pretty well overwhelming odds.
Well, there's a moment in the battle at Arnhem where, despite I should stop doing this. Stop thinking of the film, Oliver. Right, the General Urquhart, the commander of airborne forces in Arnhem, is basically out of the game for more than a day. And to me, this is pretty unforgivable for a commander to go wandering off in a jeep on his with sort of two other chaps, and then, as I say, he's not seen for another sort of 36 hours. Is this unforgivable, or is he really, because of the radio's not working, he really needed to see what was going on the ground? So I'm wrong in saying that it's unforgivable.
Well, you're not wrong, but if one of the important things is communications. If you're a commander, you've got to have communications to your subordinate units. If for some reason you haven't got that communication, then you either got to use a plethora of ADCs, which is what Wellington, for example, used, or you've got to get out on the ground and see it for yourself. And the problem there was that the communications didn't work. But to be AWOL for that length of time, and people didn't know where he was. I mean, he should have, yes, visited the unit, see what was happening, but he should have been sending back, even if it was just a runner, to the tactical headquarters saying, right, this is where I am, this is where I'm going. So again, don't take too much from the film.
The fighting at the bridge with Frost, I remember reading, and I can't remember which book this is, but German accounts are describing this as hard, if not harder, than the fighting in Stalingrad. Does that fit with your knowledge on the German the bridge?
Well, Stalingrad went on for much, much longer than the fighting at Arnhem Bridge. So I don't think that's true. I think Stalingrad was much, much worse.
Well, yes, certainly didn't last as long, but the intensity in those 4 or 5 days.
Well, there's a feature going on now that is a recurring feature of the German opinion about themselves after the war, that the fighting is all like Stalingrad. It happens in Arnhem, it happens in Aachen, happens in the Ardennes. They seem to think that Stalingrad was their crowning moment, and we've got to try and get to that level. I think a lot of it is nonsense. Beatrich himself was suggesting in his commentary that the British had tough NCOs in Arnhem who were fighting to the end, and he put his NCOs, German NCOs, implying therefore that whoever was going to win this battle, it was a battle of wills between and toughness between SS NCOs and British NCOs. And he came away saying, well, of course, the British didn't get supported, but I would like to say they were a great elite. I kind of take all of that stuff as a pinch of salt. I have no problem regarding the Red Berets as incredibly brave soldiers. But I can understand Sosabowski thinking afterwards, hang on a minute, we've got light resistance forces in Warsaw hanging out for 63 days against some of the most incredible German forces that have ever been against people and against armed resistance. And here's a modern British division only lasting less than a week. And I can understand people being not convinced that that's right. I think a lot of it comes down to the ferociousness of the battle. The lads are not getting the equipment and the supplies to sustain their fight, so they eventually have to give up the fight. I think what happens at Oosterbeek, as you said, Urquhart went on a disappearing act. He actually blames himself for that, and I think that's fair. What surprised me about Urquhart's disappearance is the fact that the junior commanders below him had a tiff over how they were going to perform better. And that tells me that when these airborne guys went into this drop, there was no contingencies. I find it very interesting that an airborne force going in for a coup de main attack doesn't have a contingency over what happens if the commander is out of the game. You would have thought that was a primary decision on the process of who goes next and how that works. To have two senior officers arguing whether the battalion should go that way or should go that way.
Well, they had a row over whether one was more senior than the other.
Yeah, they came down to an argument over who had command. I mean, it sounds, it's a bit like that moment in the Zulu film when Michael Caine is junior to
Stanley Baker, yes.
Stanley Baker. And you're thinking, this is not the time for doing this kind of thing, chap. Shall we just get on with the war? But it strikes me that this was a fatal flaw within the British command structure in Arnhem. Okay, what would have happened if Urquhart's glider had crashed? Then what would have happened? Who was going to take command? So the fact that these processes weren't in place, I think that made it harder for them. I think the fact that Urquhart was unable to get more support to Frost was very difficult. But at the same time, I think Student was very clever. He says to Beatrix, seal them up, bottle them in, and then crush them. And of course, that concept of crushing centers of resistance, it's the same thing that's happening in Warsaw. They crush them and implode them and then pour heavy firepower on top of those concentrated areas. So, I mean, you know, I think we have to realize it must have been living hell for those boys in Oosterbeek and in Arnhem, having to face almost Panther tanks and Mark IVs and H8mm guns literally firing at them. It must have been horrendous, incredibly brave. And you can understand why they all get these VCs. The Germans are relentless. And so to go back on, you know, this idea that Beatrice is this honourable man, he's not an honourable man. He's putting flamethrowers to these guys. If he wants to fight a fair fight, fine. But putting flamethrowers, Panther tanks, anything to crush the resistance, that's another story. And of course, you know, for the Germans to get a small victory like this, there's Knight's Crosses to be had. Very political.
Well, I mean, hang on. If you've got flamethrowers and Panther tanks, why shouldn't you use them? I mean, you know, it's not a game of cricket, I'm afraid. I mean, the Germans don't play cricket. I don't think it's at all unreasonable to use tanks and flamethrowers if that's going to save your own casualties. I mean, that's
of course.
The Americans had flamethrowers, didn't they?
Yeah, of course.
We didn't. We didn't.
That's not my point.
Oh, we did. Oh, right.
It's not the point. You can't say, you know, you're having a fair fight when it's clearly not a fair fight. It's a totally unfair fight.
But you want to make your fight unfair from your point of view.
That's right.
Don't you?
That's right. But that's Beatrix, and Beatrix is still trying to save his bottom from criminal activity that he conducted during the wartime, generate as many friends as possible.
We're running out of time. I wanted to sum things up, really. But one area that I did want to discuss is that I think Montgomery, after the operation, described it as a success. I think 90%, or he thought it was successful. And the Crown Prince of the Netherlands famously said that we cannot endure another one of Montgomery's successes. But there were huge numbers of Dutch civilians killed in this operation, as well as, you know, the losses that the British suffered. So I wanted to mention the sort of, you know, the Dutch experience as well. But from everything that you've mentioned, both of you, I still am finding it difficult to understand whether it was worth it. I mean, I understand that if you took part in the battle, you don't want to think it's a waste. But if we do look at it in the cold light of day, it just does seem so expensive from both Dutch civilians and certainly the British and the Americans suffered as well. Are we really still saying, Philip, you're still convinced that this was the right thing to do?
Yeah, I think generals have to make unpleasant decisions and have to go to war. I mean, I listened to Kate ter Horst describing her experience on a German television program a few years ago. And she struck me as a remarkable lady who went through the experience and had been damaged by it for the rest of her life. You know, she loved the British because the British tried to protect her. This is very much central to a lot of Dutch thinking. And it's remarkable, but you've got to imagine Montgomery is going to make a decision. If it had succeeded, would you have had the Ardennes offensive?
Okay, that's a good question. Gordon, you were chuckling away when I mentioned the member of the Dutch royal family.
Well, no, I've always thought, as you know, I'm a great fan of Montgomery. I think he's the greatest man ever born. In fact, I think he's a nice little shit. But there we go. No, I've always enjoyed the Dutch Crown Prince's remark. But of course, one's got to remember one of the aftermaths of this for the Dutch was very basic. The Dutch starved. because the Germans, as a reprisal, cut off exports of food to Holland. And the poor old Dutch were starving. In fact, the RAF then had to start airdropping food into Holland. So the Dutch, they took a severe hammering as a result of this operation. So yeah, I'm with the Dutch Crown Prince on that particular point.
Can you both clear it up for me, though? The front line, which was, I think, at Leopoldsville at the beginning of the operation, a few months later, I think in December, where is the front line? Is it still at... It's not far off Leopoldsville, is it? It hasn't advanced. I mean, what I'm trying to say is the gains made in the operation were subsequently lost in the months afterwards. Is that correct?
Yeah, but they did manage to retain a sort of jump off point. So I mean, from that point of view, there was something that came out of it. But the Germans never succeeded in recapturing the whole of the area. In fact, they didn't. I don't think they really tried very hard. But yeah, a certain amount of land was retained, and it was a useful jumping off point for the next phase.
The German losses in the battle, were they significant for subsequent battles?
All German losses ever since Bagration is started in June and Normandy, Falaise Pocket in August are significant because now they are on the downward curve. There's only so many people you can take out of the Wehrmacht Reserve. The Germans had a calendar of Wehrmacht Reserve forces. You can only turn so many foresters into rifle carriers. You're running out of supplies, incapable of producing the kind of quantity of equipment. When you have the equipment, you haven't got the people to train the people to fly airplanes or drive tanks. So from now on, it's going to be very difficult. The Germans have a false line. They think they fought hard in Aachen. They didn't really. They expended a few battalions in the center of the town. It cost the Americans an awful lot of time. Then the Americans got involved in the Hurtgenwald, and that all went tits up. So you basically got a period where there's like an inertia in the forward advance. You'd had that great momentum which led you to Falaise and then on to Brussels and then moving fast. And then Eisenhower comes along with this broad front nonsense, and the whole thing slows down to the Allies fighting one German unit at a time, as my friend Roger Cirillo says. It all becomes very shoddy and broken down. Would I still support Montgomery's audacious move? Yeah, every time. I mean, he is the finest general of the Second World War. He comes out with the best results, and he won the war in the end. So, it's easy.
I'm so glad we're all speaking
violently ill.
Well,
Montgomery is not the finest general of the Second World War.
I tell you what, we should have a Montgomery showdown between the two of you in a future episode. But both of you, this has been absolutely brilliant. A tour de force. Links to both Philip and Gordon's books are in the show notes, and as well as those others that we've mentioned. I won't put A Bridge Too Far in there. Currently, it's going to be Doorstopper. And that sounds like it's a good job for a book like that. It seems harsh because I so enjoyed it when I read it when I was about 14, 15. But this has been great. Thank you very much for your time, both. And I hope you can join us again soon, listeners. Thanks, Gordon. Thanks, Philip.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening. The final part in our Market Garden series is the Film Club, as Roger Morehouse and Tim Hewitt join to chat the movie, the all-star cast, inaccuracies and much more. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.